The title of this video is, Will there be a peace treaty in Ukraine? And the answer is no. Simple as that. There will be no peace treaty. This war is going to go to the brutal end, and the end is inevitable. The end is that Ukraine, the Ukrainian nation, will be utterly destroyed, and it will be taken apart. As I thought over 6 weeks ago now, well, what's going to happen is that the east and the south of Ukraine will be annexed by Russia. A big chunk of the west of modern-day Ukraine, of current Ukraine, will be eaten up by Poland and a smaller piece by Hungary. And the rump Ukraine that will remain, that will stretch from Kiev to Ivano-Frankivsk or Ternopil, something like that, well, that rump Ukraine will be just a desolate wasteland. And it's a hard and heartbreaking thing to admit, but it's the truth. And it's something that on a personal level, me personally, having gone across the entire country and seen it and met such wonderful people and just seen the beauty of the country, it just breaks my heart. It absolutely is not a fate that I would wish on Ukraine. On the contrary. But this is what's going to happen, because there will be no peace treaty. And why will there be no peace treaty? Because of the United States and the people currently in charge. The Biden administration, Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, all of these craven people are the reason there will be no peace treaty, and why Ukraine will be torn asunder, and what remains of Ukraine will be a hollow shell, a lunar landscape. Let me explain. You see, any sensible leader long ago would have sued for peace in the current circumstances. When Russia invaded, Russia wanted a political solution. You have to keep in mind that unlike the American mode of war, the Russians have a different approach to war. They use war as a continuation of politics and diplomacy. Political negotiation, diplomatic negotiations, those are extended by military force, but military force does not curtail them. And so what the Russians were thinking in their initial assault on Ukrainian territory was to have multiple lines of attack, any of which could be expanded as the need be, have them ready, just lay down these lines. For instance, putting 30,000, 40,000 troops around Kiev, certainly not enough to capture the city. You'd need at least 10 times that number to capture Kiev, but enough to pin down forces and know that and teach people that you're serious. The same thing with Sumy, Kharkov, the Donbass, the south. There were lines that were laid, and they attacked, certainly, but not with full power in each of these lines, because the notion initially from the Russians was, of course, they wanted to negotiate. And what did they want? They wanted guarantees of Ukrainian neutrality, removal of NATO forces, and hands off insofar as the Donbass, and an acceptance that Crimea was always going to be Russian. Fairly reasonable. And now, if those terms were offered to any rational government, any rational government, any rational person would be like, sure, yes, if you're going to pull out from the rest of Ukraine, the rest of my country, I'll happily agree to those 4 conditions, right? But now it's far too late. Because what happened was that from the very get-go, the Zelensky regime insisted on fighting to the death, that they were going to expunge the Russian invaders no matter what. And of course, that was just not possible, not physically possible, militarily possible. It's just not feasible. For a very simple reason, the Russians have a bigger army. It's not more complicated than that. They have a bigger army, and any NATO army that could have saved Ukraine is, number one, so far away, and number two, so ill-equipped and so undermanned that, as a realistic matter, NATO would never be able to get into Ukraine and save the day. And the fact is that we've gone now, 10 weeks of this war? Over 10 weeks of this war. And see, kind of like proves my point. Are NATO ground troops, are there like NATO tanks maneuvering in Ukraine? No, and they never will. And so the point is that, see, The Zelensky regime refused to negotiate, thinking that somehow they'd be able to pull in NATO troops on the ground to assist in expelling the Russian invaders. And the Russians tried to negotiate during the month of March because it was a negotiation. Of course, they were attacking, they were gaining ground, capturing territory, and that should have been a sign. But they were still continuing the track of negotiations. Not that seriously, but they were continuing it with the hope that, well, maybe, why not? But near the end of March, it became clear to the Russians that there'd be no negotiated settlement because the Zelensky regime was so intransigent. Now, why were they so intransigent? Why had they dug in their heels? Because around Zelensky is in a cocoon of far-right extremists, neo-Nazis, crazy people. And these people, well, the Russians know who they are, and the Russians want to get them. And they've made no bones about it. And so this group of people around Zelensky are terrified of being captured by the Russians, so they're not going to allow it. But what's emerged, especially over the last couple of weeks, is that the West will not allow Zelensky to sue for peace under any circumstances. Boris Johnson went to Kiev, Nancy Pelosi went to Kiev, Anthony Blinken, Lloyd Austin. I mean, it's like a parade of dignitaries going to Kiev, right? But the message is always the same. Number one, you will get money. Number two, you will get weapons. But the condition is, number three, you do not sue for peace. You do not negotiate a ceasefire. You keep on fighting to the end. And the Zelensky regime, they're down with that because they figure that they can get some money from the money that's pouring into Ukraine, and they can get some more money from all the weapons coming into Ukraine, which they are punting to weapons dealers. I mean, I would guess that at this point, roughly between a quarter and a third of any weapons coming into Ukraine, which are really, small arms stuff, nothing special, it's being diverted to weapons manufacturers. I mean, there are boards that are talking about how much weapons are being extracted from Ukraine, man. The weapons dealers, the black market weapons dealers, they're having a field day. They're getting all this American gear, NATO gear, at discounted prices because the Ukrainians are just punting it, whatever, just a few $100 for a Stinger missile or whatever. Yeah. So weapons dealers are happy as clams, but of course, see, the weapons are not going to Ukrainian soldiers because here's the problem, man. See, with this war, after 70 days, the Ukrainians are running out of soldiers. That's a fact. The Russians are posting film of Ukrainian POWs. And these men are in their late 30s, early 40s. You can tell by their stance, by their look, they're middle-aged guys. And middle-aged guys who on February 24th were civilians. They weren't doing any kind of military stuff back then when this war started. But now here they are in military garb, but still, fat, with that layer of civilian plump, right? Captured by Russians. But no healthy, lean young men. What does that tell you? They're running out of men. They're running out of soldiers. Any reasonable government would sue for peace, but the Zelensky regime can't or won't because of the money and the weapons pouring in. And because, and this is very important, all of these leaders who have come to Kiev, they have also told Zelensky and his crew something else that hasn't been broadcast, but it's so easy to realize. They have told them that if things really fall apart, we will extract you. Zelensky and his immediate family already have British passports. And they haven't lived a day in their lives in Britain. I'm sure they've gone there, traveled on the money that they stole in Ukraine because Zelensky has a fortune of over $500 million. How the hell do you think that happened, huh? By his acting gig or his salary as Ukrainian president? Come on, he stole it because it's corrupt. And so, He and his family have British passports, and I bet like a lot of the other people in the inner circle of the Zelensky regime have their British passports. And more importantly, it's not just the document, it's the assurance of the British government and the American government that if the whole situation in Ukraine implodes, they will be extracted, they will be taken to Great Britain or the United States or wherever else they want to, and they will not be prosecuted, and they will always have their money and their documentation, and they will live a lovely, happy life so long as now, right now, while they are in charge of Ukraine, they sacrifice the entire country so that they allow the Russians to kill as many Ukrainians as possible so as to, quote unquote, wear down the Russians, because that's their goal. They don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian nation. All they care about is wearing down Russia. They have this bizarre, crazy notion that each Ukrainian soldier killed somehow diminishes Russia a little bit more. And it's a crazy mentality. It's literally human sacrifice, for crying out loud. And the people who are being sacrificed are the Ukrainian people. And the people doing it is Zelensky and his regime, his little entourage of crazy people all around him. And they've gotten assurances from the West that they will survive and prosper and be rich if they sacrifice Ukraine on this altar. This is what's going on. This is why there will be no peace treaty, no ceasefire. This war is going to go on to the very, very bitter end, where all of Ukraine is utterly destroyed. And it's because of the Brits, but of course, the Brits are just the Chihuahua. It's the Americans. They're the ones to blame.